Welcome to episode 80 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, all spelled out, seven-health.com/80.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey all, thanks for joining me for another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel, and today is another episode where I'm sitting down with a guest, and this is actually a returning guest. So prior to this, Ari Whitten was the only person who I'd had on the show twice, but now Isabel Foxen Duke makes it into the illustrious and exclusive club of being a two-time visitor to the show. And Isabel is a certified health coach and emotional eating expert. She helps women make peace with their bodies so they can stop obsessing about food and get back to living awesome lives. After years of trying to overcome emotional eating through traditional and alternative approaches, Isabel discovered some radical new ways to get women over their food issues once and for all. She's been featured in the Huffington Post, Elle magazine, XO Jane, and has even been praised by Ricky Lake. And for more information, you can find her at isabelfoxenduke.com. So I've been a huge fan of Isabel's work since I first stumbled on her writing probably three and a half years ago. She has a training program called Stop Fighting Food Masterclass, which I've actually gone through and I found incredibly valuable. I'm also one of the guest lecturers for that program, but I do highly recommend it, and you can find more about that at stopfightingfood.com. So as part of this episode, we actually spent a lot of time delving into just a handful of topics. So we look at sugar and sugar addiction and how beliefs around this play out. We talk about Overeaters Anonymous, and Isabel shares her experience of being a participant in this group for 4 or 5 years. And finally, we chat about body positivity and the body positive movement, and looking at the historical roots and where it could be maybe doing better, and why certain industries have been so helpful at promoting the conversation and others have been unhelpful in terms of hijacking it. I really enjoyed this chat. One thing I just want to make note of, and I made the same note in the intro to the Chris Masterjohn podcast, which is to apologize for my sound quality. And both of these podcasts were recorded within days of one another, and I hadn't started the editing, so I didn't discover what the issue was, but I've now figured it out. So it meant that despite having my nice, expensive microphone plugged in and turned on, it just recorded from the microphone on my Mac. So if when I'm talking it sounds like I'm sitting in some tin shed, you know why. So with this intro out of the way, let's get going with the main part of the show. Here is my second conversation with Isabel Foxen Duke. Hey Isabel, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks for joining me again.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Awesome. So this is round 2. You were one of the first people I interviewed on the podcast, I think back in June or July of 2015, and I was very nervous at the time. I got much more comfortable with podcasting as it's gone on. And I'd say rather than going back through your whole history, I'm going to direct people to check out that first conversation. You can go to www.7-health/06, and I'll put it in the show notes, but you can hear the first part of this and a lot about Isabel's backstory. But maybe as a brief introduction, do you want to just tell people maybe how do you describe what you do, or what is your core message about what you're about?
Yeah. So, my tagline, right? Like what I feel like is sort of like my opening line, which I think is the best way to describe what I do in a nutshell, is I help women stop feeling crazy around food. And so, I think really what I do differently than other people is, for a huge portion of my life, I was constantly obsessing about food, diet binge cycling frequently, constantly trying to control my weight, and of course, constantly falling completely out of control of my food/weight. Wherever during most of that time, there was not a lot of conversation in the media and books and anywhere that was giving people solutions to binge eating, emotional eating, these words that I very much related to at the time, in a way that, worked, just straight up worked for me, right? Like I just struggled for a really, really, really long time, taking all sorts of different direction from different people. I was in various different treatments. I was, reading everything I could possibly read. And I was hearing conflicting messages everywhere I went, which I think is something we'll talk about today. I heard, oh, you're addicted to sugar. Oh, you've got to be on a strict meal plan. Oh, you've got to, intuitive eating is the answer. I mean, it was just, everyone kind of had an opposite, everyone had a very different perspective. There wasn't a lot of consensus. Yeah. And so that was very confusing, and it was a lot to weed through. And, over time, I sort of developed a pretty specific perspective, and I realized that one of the, the sort of large reasons why so many of these different perspectives were failing with me was because they weren't really about helping me calm down around food for the sake of sanity. They were, in some degree, trying to help me control my food for the purpose of weight loss, weight control. It was all still very diet mentality. And I think that kept me in a lot of just the same old unhealthful on the wagon, off the wagon behaviors for a really, really, really long time. So at some point, I kind of decided I'm going to put my sanity first, right? Like I'm going to change my relationship with food first. Whatever happens to my weight is what happens to my weight. But like, this is not a way that I cannot spend my life obsessing about food, obsessing with trying to fix my food. This is not functional for me anymore. And that shift was sort of the point where things really started to change for me. And I learned an enormous amount about body positivity, body image work, health at every size. I learned really what does it mean to have a sane relationship with food that is not constantly steeped in, for the purpose of weight loss in quotes. And ironically, what ended up happening was that as I relaxed around food and as I really, kind of let go of this constant desire to control my food and my weight, food and weight stopped being as much of an issue. And I sort of started naturally eating, like the way, you think quote unquote normal people do who don't really think about it and just sort of can have the pizza or not have the pizza or whatever the case may be. And so that was the experience I started writing about. And that's the experience that I really want to share with women, because I think that there's a lot of kind of destructive messages about particularly healing from binge eating and emotional eating and quote compulsive eating that I'm really excited to talk to you about today.
Cool. So one of the things I definitely want to chat with and I want to start with is you wrote a pretty amazing piece recently, and I shared it on my Facebook page in regards to sugar and sugar addiction. So do you want to explain your stance on the whole sugar is addictive saga, and we can have a chat about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I come at this as a person who felt like a sugar addict for a very, very long time. Like I really believed and I really clung on to this idea, oh, yes, I'm an addict. That must be why I binge eat, right? I must be addicted to sugar, right? And I really felt that way for many years. And I think the reason that so many of us feel that way is because as most of us who are dieters, right, we're very highly steeped in diet culture. It doesn't occur to us that dieting actually is a setup for binge eating, right? We all are sort of running around believing that dieting is functional and that people can effectively, quote, control their food if they, do it right, get the right willpower, are in the right emotional state, whatever the case may be. That being said, in reality, when we look at people who try to abstain from sugar, right, which is not too dissimilar than going on a diet where you're not supposed to eat sugar, right? I mean, functionally, they're very similar things with slightly different language. But, people generally who try to abstain from sugar forever indefinitely generally do not succeed at that goal, right? I mean, quote unquote success rates at sugar abstinence long term are not too dissimilar to quote unquote diet success long term, right? Because again, they are functionally sort of the same thing. So, when I came to intuitive eating and sort of realized, and of course, I will just mention for the record, one of the things that I experienced when I was, quote unquote, trying, when I was trying to, quote, abstain from sugar was that when I would eventually fall off the wagon, right? The binges would be bigger and greater than ever, right? And so I noticed one thing that was happening when I was sort of, the more I bought into the sugar addiction model, the more I proved myself right that I couldn't have one bite without falling completely in the other direction. It was almost like the more I believed in the sugar addiction narrative, the harder I would binge if for some reason I had a piece of sugar, right? Like as a child, I could have sugar and not go completely apeshit wild on it, right? But as an adult who really believed that sugar was addictive, there was this sense of, it was almost like it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Again, I did not realize that I was doing this because I was heavily embedded in the myth, heavily embedded in the belief by definition. And again, I was operating from the framework of I should be able to control my food. People in general should be able to control their food. And that to some extent, diets do work, right? And that dieting is possible when you get your head straight on, when you get your, enough willpower or whatever the case may be. So, all of this, the diet culture around us, is sort of a perfect environment for the sugar addiction narrative to exist. Now, when you actually look at this sort of scientific, in quotes, evidence for sugar addiction, it's like a pretty weak argument. Basically, what came out, there was like a few years ago, or I don't even remember when the original research was published, but the clinical research that sort of, quote unquote, proves sugar addiction, basically is just noticing this basic reaction in the brain, wherein when people eat sugar, but particularly dieters, right? But I mean, we don't even need to go there. I'll just say when certain people eat sugar, and actually they didn't even, well, I'm going to back up for a second. Certain people, when they eat sugar, have higher levels of dopamine, right? Dopamine rushes to their brain more than others. And some people, I think part of the research is that sugar in general just increases dopamine in the brain, right? Like it's a sweet, pleasurable thing that you're biologically designed to like, increases dopamine in the brain. And the comparison was to increases in dopamine in the brain that are similar to the dopamine you experience when you're snorting cocaine, right? So there was this like whole giant media campaign, sugar increases dope in the brain, just like cocaine, right? I mean, like the most fear-mongering, ridiculous headline that you could possibly imagine. Now, if you really look at it, if we really want to talk about dopamine in the brain is just your pleasure signals going off. And sure, cocaine certainly will create that reaction, right? But lots of things create that reaction. Basically, anything that's pleasurable creates that reaction. Sex creates that reaction. Listening to really beautiful music that you love creates that reaction. Dopamine is something that's going to happen when you're experiencing pleasure in various capacities. So it's, again, very fear-mongering kind of language that was being used around this research. Again, because so many women feel like, quote unquote, in particular, specifically dieters, feel, quote unquote, out of control around sugar, right, and have a sort of binge eating reaction, this became like fuel. This became like, somehow evidence to back up this narrative and this belief about themselves, which of course I think, for me personally, like I always felt like, this is so real and this is, abstinence from sugar is going to save me. It's the thing that's going to heal me. And like, when you're really struggling with binge eating, all you want is the answer, right? Like all you want is the answer with a capital A, and like whatever you can like grasp onto that you think is going to give you some semblance of control, you start to become attached to with religious conviction, or at least I certainly did. But of course, again, irrespective of any research, irrespective of like, any kind of sort of scientific or sort of semantic argument about what addiction is or is not, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second, the fact remains, right, that very few people actually successfully abstain from sugar forever. Like it's an incredibly difficult thing to avoid for your entire life. Most people don't do it, and the people who are capable of doing it often will exhibit, very eating disorder tendencies, right? Like you can't go out to a restaurant without having to like check the menu and like doing all of these, in many ways very life-sucking activities in order to, quote unquote, manage this addiction. And again, even in those instances, most of the time people end up rebelling, binge eating, falling off the wagon eventually. So you have, quote unquote, successful abstinence rates that are not dissimilar to successful dieting rates, meaning basically slim to none. Yeah. Now, there's also, and I'll just mention really quickly, when we talk about, the idea that dopamine in the brain being released like cocaine therefore makes it addiction is also like a totally fear-mongering sentence for completely other reasons. Physical addiction has nothing to do with whether or not dopamine is released in the brain. Physical addiction is about physical withdrawal symptoms, right? When you're talking about things like heroin or cigarettes or alcohol, right? These have actually very serious physical withdrawals. That's why we call them physically addictive. You actually create physical dependence and need them in order to not feel awful when you're coming down. That is not the case with sugar, right? So there's just so many. I mean, again, I could go on and on about the details of why this argument is sort of scientifically unsound. But I think even if you just fully wanted to buy into the science, the fact still remains that abstinence rates from sugar are just very, very, very low. But on the flip side, when we see people making peace with sugar, we actually see in many instances that people can actually, quote unquote, learn to eat sugar normally. And that is by not villainizing sugar, not trying to control sugar, actually being able to have a peaceful, quote, sane relationship with food. And so I think that's probably, the proof is in the pudding there, in my opinion. If the abstinence, irrespective of any kind of scientific or sort of chemical argument, when you take two groups of people and, half of them are attempting abstinence. And of course, in the long run, they might feel great for a while. They might feel really powerful. I got this, no sugar thing. This is awesome. Yeah. But then inevitably, eventually, the time is going to come, likely when that person falls off the wagon, and is not going to be pretty. Unlike, somebody who's sort of more pursuing legalization and intuitive eating, making peace with all foods, that might be sort of the more challenging road initially. Because it's scary. You have to overcome tons of diet mentality. There's so much emotional work to do. Like that's however, in the long run, people are actually able to heal their relationship with food for good, and eat the way they did when they were children, eat according to their birthright. And so I'll leave it with that for now. It's a big question. So
yeah, no, sure. Look, and
a lot going on.
I would say with my experience with working with clients, there are lots who come to me and claim that they are chocolate addicts or sugar addicts or whatever it may be. And by the end of the process of working together, they don't have that claim anymore. And It's not because we've banned it or we've made it a forbidden food. It's normally the opposite. It's like you can have those foods, but and when people are then eating to satiety, they're allowing themselves to eat properly. That also starts to disappear. And just in regards to the comments around dopamine, so many things cause heightened dopamine. And I know you listed some of them. Getting sunlight increases dopamine. Having a glass of water will increase your dopamine. So there's lots of things that increase dopamine, and they are there for purely survival reasons. As a species, we need those things. We need sunshine. We need water. We need food and sex and And I don't know what the biological need for music is, but there are those other things that increase that dopamine. So yeah, I think it's a pretty weak argument. I've also seen a lot of the research in regards to rats when they've done this is they completely confine them. They put them in cages where there's nothing for them to do, and then they give them something that's either plain water or sugar water. And you've got the thing that's sugar water, which is this tiny little thrill that they get because they've got nothing else going on. And when you put someone in that kind of an environment, of course they're going to overeat on those things, or of course they're going to get much more pleasure from it because they've got nothing else to entertain them.
Right. And on the flip, I'm sure you've heard this. This was sort of catty corner to that research was when you put a rat in rat paradise with lots of different toys and lots of different exercises and lots of different opportunities for play. Even if the sugar water is in the cage within the rat paradise, even if there's sugar water in the rat paradise, if they are engaged and stimulated in their life in other ways, they're probably going to have a relatively non-compulsive relationship with sugar, so to speak.
Yeah, no, definitely. So one of the times, the last time we spoke, we chatted about your story, but one of the areas we didn't cover was your experience with OA or Overeaters Anonymous. And so I'd love for you tell this part of your story, but also just give your impressions or opinions on Overeaters Anonymous and how useful, unuseful it is.
Yeah, well, so, and this is, again, like totally parallel to my Overeaters Anonymous was where I first defined myself as a sugar addict. Overeaters Anonymous has various different branches. There's various different types of Overeaters Anonymous. They're all somewhat restrictive to some extent, and I think that that's sort of the downfall of OA in many ways, is that it does function on a, quote, abstinence model, which I now understand today to be, again, not too dissimilar to dieting, right? I mean, if you're talking about the concept of abstinence, the concept of actively trying to forcibly remove or take things out or keep yourself from eating certain ways is really not too dissimilar functionally from the concept of dieting, right? And we know that these things don't usually work for people long-term, right? People long-term are not capable of forcibly controlling their food through willpower. And again, I think or through, various forms of like emotional manipulation, right? I mean, I think many people in OA would say, I'm not using willpower, I'm, using my emotional tools. No evidence that this actually makes dieting work, or no evidence that this actually makes, quote unquote, attempts at abstinence work, right? Functionally speaking, you're trying to do something that we have no evidence to suggest the majority of people can actually do, right? 95% of people who walk in the doors attempting a diet, a meal plan, on any kind of attempt at forcible abstinence or forcible control around food will fail in the long run. And so, I was in OA for a really, really long time, and it's an incredibly compelling place to be, particularly because binge eating is so shameful, emotional eating is so shameful, and it's something that we hide. It's something that we, most people are incredibly reluctant to talk about. Yeah. And so, you go to OA and you're sort of welcomed by, this group of people who, A, you feel like you can be yourself with because they understand, but B, they are all saying, I really get you, like I was a binge eater too, or I am a binge eater too, and like, here's a space where we can like recover together. And like, this is the answer. And again, there's lots of religious language, all the whole kit and caboodle of just sort of emotionally compelling language being used in these rooms, supported by, again, a lot of community around something that is socially shameful, which I think is, it's almost like people feel safe in OA. I mean, I remember going to OA meetings thinking, this is my safe space. Like, this is where I feel safe. This is where I feel okay to be myself. And, these people understand me. No one else understands me. No one really understands. I always thought to myself, no one really understands what it's like to be like a full on, like low bottom back alley binge eater where you are like in your bed in the fetal position and calling in sick from work the next day because like of how much you ate the night before. No one understands this. No one understands me, and like, I'm so special and different and so fucked up. And then you go to OA and it's like, oh my gosh, like this is my tribe. These are my people. And so, very compelling. Unfortunately, however, if you, the reality of the situation again is that not that many people who actually walk in the doors of OA just end up abstinence for the rest of their life. That is an incredibly small percentage of people. And it's confusing because, if you go to an OA meeting, it'll be like half the people will still be struggling and they'll be like, have been there for 10 years and saying, I'm on day one again. And then half the people will be like the lifers who are like the, really the 5%ers, right? Who are like, the few people who, have been quote unquote successful at abstinence and sort of are really promoting what is effectively, kind of diet mentality, right? And so, it's a very, very confusing place to be. I mean, at the time you feel very convicted and it totally, I think it's so compelling for dieters in particular because dieters generally, typically speaking, don't challenge diet mentality, right? When I was in OA, I'd never heard the term diet mentality. It didn't occur to me that again, that there was a thing called diet mentality, or that dieting didn't work. I'd never heard the term body positivity. I never heard any of these things that we know now through science and research are actually pretty important in this whole recovery conversation. And so, it's sort of like you go somewhere where everyone seems to understand you and you all have this shared common goal of, quote unquote, getting your food under control, and you're completely blinded. You have no idea that this desire to get your food under control is actually what is spurring on these binges, and is what actually is keeping you full on obsessed with food, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know, it's hard to know, is this OA's fault, or is this the diet culture's fault in general? OA is a product of diet culture. OA didn't invent it. And so, that was sort of my experience in OA, but I will say it was very hard to leave, despite being in OA for like 4 or 5 years. 4 or 5, maybe even 6 years in total. Well, no, 4 or 5 years. I was in OA off and on for 4 or 5 years. And, I never got more than a month of, quote, abstinence, and I'm sure, there are, of course, people who can get more than that. I was for me, my willpower was getting so worn down over time through dieting that my capacity for dieting, literally started to crumble. When I was, younger, I could go on a diet and I could successfully lose weight for 6 months to a year. Right. And then over time, my ability to control myself actually weakened. And I now realize again that that's a function of dieting, and that dieting does, is not a muscle that grows over time. Your capacity for dieting is not something that grows over time. It's something that weakens over time. Yeah. But yeah, this all to say, it was really hard to leave OA because there is sort of this, for lack of a better word, I don't want to use the word cultish because I think that gets thrown around a lot, particularly for 12-step groups. But there's this sort of real community aspect with sort of religious conviction around what is right, and it's so you're so emotionally compelled that it can be really challenging to leave. That being said, at some point, I remember having I remember the last time that I was in OA. It was actually the first time I ever got 30 days of abstinence. The first time in 4 years that I ever got 30 days straight sticking to my, quote, plan of eating. I got my 30-day chip. Everyone's clapping for me. Feels so great. Oh, you did it, Isabel. And I got my 30 chip and I was so happy. And I was yes, I did it, and the next day I binged my brains out. And it was 4 or 5 days, just could not stop eating, just completely lost my shit. And I was I can't do this anymore, and I'd heard of intuitive eating. I'd been dancing in and out of intuitive eating. Intuitive eating made a lot of sense to me, but was really scary. The thing about that I think is really challenging about intuitive eating and attempts at intuitive eating, putting aside briefly for the fact that I was doing it as a weight control manipulation tactic, which is self-sabotage practice number 1. Yeah. But putting that aside, intuitive eating is really scary because, I always say intuitive eating is hardest on day 1 and it gets easier over time, right? Intuitive eating is a skill that you develop. Yeah. Dieting is the opposite. Dieting's easy on day 1. Diets, day 1 is the best day. Day 1 is the day you're I got this. This is the diet that's going to save my life. I'm on top of the world. I'm on my way to massive thin privilege, and unicorns and rainbows are going to pop out of the sky in about 4 months. Day 1 feels great. And then over time, you literally start to feel you're hanging on by a thread, and you're hanging on by a thread, and you're oh my God, I'm hanging on by my fingernails. Oh my God, one of my fingernails is going to crack, and you're getting more and more panicked. You can feel when you're losing it, when you're starting to lose it, you're starting to lose your grip, your willpower is starting to crumble. So dieting is so easy on day 1. It feels fucking awesome on day 1. And it's over a certain period of time, whatever that period of time is for you, at some point, it crumbles, right? It falls apart. You lose it. Intuitive eating is the opposite. Intuitive eating is so hard in the beginning, right? It's so scary. It's so oh my gosh, I ate 3 cookies. This clearly isn't working. I'm clearly not capable of controlling my sugar, right? And, and it's just there's so much trial and error, and so many, you have to so much of intuitive eating is becoming comfortable with imperfection, which most dieters do not want to do, totally freaks them out. And so I had been, jumping back and forth between intuitive eating and OA for a while. Basically, I'd of course crash and binge in OA, like inevitably, right? Like I'd have periods of abstinence and then lose my mind, crash and binge. And then of course I'd go read the intuitive eating book and I'd, dip my toe in intuitive eating. Yeah. And I'd be like, no, clearly can't do this. I cannot, this is not a good way to control my food. Like, and again, control, right? I was still trying to control it. I still wanted to make it look a certain way. I was not comfortable with the idea of having imperfect food. And so I'd like dip my toe in intuitive eating, but I'd get so freaked out. I'd be like, oh my God, I'm going to gain weight, right? And I would just immediately run back into the arms of OA. Or I'd binge in intuitive eating in my attempts at intuitive eating, because I'd perceive myself to be failing at intuitive eating when I ate 3 cookies instead of 1 or whatever. Yeah. And then of course that would spiral into, I fell off the wagon. I'm just going to eat everything. And tomorrow I'm only going to eat when I'm hungry and or whatever the case may be. Again, lots of diet. I was really struggling with a lot of diet mentality in my attempts at intuitive eating, which is A, why they didn't work, but B, why I would sort of run back into the arms of OA. And this sort of dance back and forth between intuitive eating and OA went on until I had this big crash and burn moment with OA where I was like, I had got my 30-day chip, binged for 5 days straight. And I just was like, I can never go back. Like, this is clearly, I can't do this anymore. And so then, had another little bout with the hunger and fullness diet, which is, I was like, okay, I guess intuitive eating is the only way to go. I'm going to only eat when I'm hungry and I'm going to stop when I'm full. I actually joined a Christian intuitive eating group that considered eating when not hungry a sin. And like, I've never been like particularly religious up until that point, but I was like, this is the answer. Like, I'm going to get on my knees and pray to God not to eat, when I'm not hungry, and that eventually fell through as well. And I had an incredibly painful binge eating episode about a month into that diet. And then it was like, oh my God, neither of these work. Like the hunger and fullness diet doesn't work. Being on a meal plan no way doesn't work. I'm not fucking capable of controlling my food. Like, I am just not physically capable of it. And that was like when I was like, now I understand what surrender means. Like, now I understand what it means to just like throw up your hands and be like, okay, I get it. I can't diet anymore. I get it. And that was the beginning of what recovery actually started to look like for me. Like, that was when I actually stopped binging pretty much. I mean, I had very messy food. I was eating Nutella out of the jar for a while. Occasionally I'll still have a bite of Nutella out of the jar. Like, why not? But, there was definitely, there was a period, I think, I gained some weight. I probably gained 10, 15 pounds, in like the course of that year. I was just like really enjoying, sweets and like not beating myself up for, okay, you may not be super hungry, but if you really want it, it's okay. Like, it's really okay. And just sort of just trying to be, like really letting go and really understanding that like trying to control my food through force, through willpower, through sheer will is just not something that I'm capable of, and always seems to backfire in these really painful ways. And so I put up my hands. I just like, okay, I can't do this anymore. Like, my food's going to be what my food's going to be. Like, I'm just going to do my best to try and be kind to myself, listen to myself. I'm going to define intuition by something other than just hunger and fullness, right? It's whatever feels right to me holistically, physically, emotionally, whatever. And it's okay to be messy, and like, I'm just going to let this go. And that was when my relationship with food finally actually really started to change.
Yeah. And I think the issue with a lot of people's approach to intuitive eating is, and I've heard you talk about this before, is you approach it as a diet, and it just has these very regimented rules, as opposed to intuitive eating should be the thing that gives you self-awareness. It should be able to open you up and allow you to start to experiment and be okay with things being a little messy or things being better or whatever, and just I think it's almost like it helps you just have a big exhalation where you're like, oh, it's okay. Like, I'm going to figure this out. And I'm going to figure this out without having to have these really clear, good, bad line in the sand rules, which is just, as you said before as well, like what causes so much of these issues.
Right. I mean, I always think I'm like intuitive eating, in my opinion, is not the answer with a capital A. The answer with a capital A is self-acceptance, self-compassion, self-love, body positivity, letting go of weight loss is the ultimate goal. Like that's the answer with a capital A. Yeah. Intuitive eating is just a tool to help me learn about my body and get to know my body and figure out how to nourish my body and what satiates her and what feels good to me. After years of ignoring her, after years and years and years of just ignoring her and not paying attention and just completely just ripping my body to shreds and just constantly trying to control her and really abuse her through dieting. And so, I can say intuitive eating is not about boundaries. It's not about trying to make your food look a certain way. It's about trying to give yourself what you need, right? It's about trying to nourish. It's about, in some ways you could make the argument intuitive eating is about making sure you get enough of the things that you need rather than, oh my God, don't eat more than what you need, right? And so it's a totally different perspective. I actually had a conversation with Elise Reich yesterday, who's one of the authors of the intuitive eating book. And she said, she basically said, I really wish that people looked at intuitive eating with the goal of satiation rather than the goal of control.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, I look at intuitive eating as a starting place as opposed to an ending place. It's a starting place to help you discover your own tools. Right. And as I said before, I think just body awareness and kind of life awareness as well is what it can start you on that journey.
Yeah, that's why it's so, I always say one of my most popular blog posts basically says, maybe it's not about hunger and fullness diet. Maybe it's about, intuition with a capital I, what feels good to you holistically all over. You're in, what actually is use your quote inner wisdom, so to speak. When you think about the word intuition outside of the context of food, what does that actually mean to you? What if you were using that side of your brain to help you make decisions around food? Which is a very different way of thinking about intuitive eating than the strict, okay, when I have the stomach growl, then I'm allowed to eat, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I didn't think that's just kind of missing the point of what it's really, really about.
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, you mentioned body positivity a little bit, and it the idea of body positivity and body love, and it seems to be everywhere these days. And I don't know if that's just because of Facebook algorithm and Google algorithm for me, and that's why it's coming up. But it is out there a lot more. So what are some of the things that you think body positivity are doing well, and what are some of the things that you don't think it's doing so well? Because I think it's a great movement, but I have some issues with certain parts, so I'd love to be able to chat with you about it.
Well, it's interesting because I think one of the issues is that there's kind of quote true historically accurate body positivity, and then there has body positivity that has been usurped and appropriated by the diet industry for their own personal marketing purposes.
Yeah.
And I think those are two very different things, right? I think that as a body positive activist, one of the things that I try to train people on is being able to identify when you're coming up against a diet that is claiming to be body positive for the sake of getting you to buy it and feel good, when in reality, this is a trap. They are actually fully just using body positive language to create their own agenda, which goes completely against body positive principles in every way. Right. So if you think about the history of body positivity, the body positive movement was basically, it's been around for a very long time, much longer than people think. But it has been, to some extent, considered like a somewhat radical movement. It's been sort of a smaller subsect of sort of feminism, and it was really created by a bunch of researchers and professionals and therapists who came to the conclusion that dieting, which in this case would be defined as attempts at trying to control your size through force, right? Like a forcible attempts at weight loss or weight control, is more harmful, right? The belief is that dieting is more harmful to people than simply being whatever size they are naturally and just engaging in healthful behaviors for healthful behavior's sake, for the sake of, weight inclusive health, right? Meaning, feel free to just, pursue mental health, pursue your therapeutic endeavors, pursue eating vegetables, moving your body, whatever feels good to you that makes you feel good, not for the sake of weight loss, but for the sake of just being healthy. And whatever weight you end up at is the weight that's probably right for you, right? And we're not going to define what that is or use weight loss as a proxy for health. The idea here being that trying to achieve weight loss as a path to health or as a means to health rather than just going after health directly is actually more problematic and more damaging, both physically and emotionally for women, people, etc. And so again, if you talk about the historically speaking, body positive means non-dieting. It means we don't try to forcibly try to change the way our bodies look. We try to actually just nourish and heal ourselves for the sake of the intrinsic rewards of those things, right? Of eating vegetables, of moving our bodies, of going to therapy or doing emotional work for the intrinsic rewards of going to therapy and doing emotional work, rather than for the intention of trying to lose weight or trying to make our bodies look a certain way. And so this is, I think it's really, really, really important that people understand if you are selling weight loss as a goal, you are not body positive by definition, by the actual definition of that word. You can redefine body positivity so many people are like, I'm very body positive, but I'm trying to lose weight for X, Y, and Z reason. That's just not what the definition of body positivity is. That's just wrong. You can say, I love myself, or I'm working on, healing my relationship with the mirror, but I also want to, you can do whatever the hell you want to do, but that's not what body positivity is from an actual historically accurate definition. So I don't know if that's, that's sort of, I'll say as a primer. So, thoughts on that, actually. I'd like to hear your response to that. I don't know if that's what you were referring to or what your experience. Yeah.
No, so one of the things where I think body positivity falls down from my perspective is I think there's way too much of a focus on the aesthetic, and that everyone has to think that they look sexy or hot or any of those things. And from my perspective, body positivity should be about, not everyone needs to value how they look as the most important thing in their life. And it should be much more about what can you do, what is interesting, etc. I just think too much of it still is around, how someone looks.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hear this argument. This is certainly an argument that exists around. I have definitely, I have absolute respect for that position. I absolutely think that we should be raising young girls to value being something other than, quote, beautiful, right? When you think about how particularly women, and this is not as much with men, but particularly with women, and men to some extent, but again, there's no doubt this is a gendered issue.
Yeah.
We really raise women to really, feel that their value is in their beauty, right? And that, the way they look is how they are being valued, which has been the case historically, unfortunately, right? And part of the sort of greater feminist movement is about dismantling and challenging that assumption. That being said, I think that's absolutely valid. That being said, I think that there's always beauty as a construct is not going to not exist, right? The thin ideal has existed for 100 years or maybe 150 max, right? Beauty as a construct, particularly, is something that has existed forever. Beauty as something that has social value has existed since antiquity.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's ever been a time in history where beauty has not held some sort of social value or been socially constructed in some way. Has not held social value. And it just so happens that beauty is socially constructed, meaning we as a society decide what is beautiful. Now, one of the things that's so damaging about the thin ideal is now you're turning away from a beauty ideal, which may have just been about, wearing makeup or like having your hair dyed a certain way or whatever, or things that you can't, that people don't necessarily try to change, right? Like, people talk about intrinsic, some people are just, quote, naturally beautiful or, naturally less beautiful or whatever. And that's obviously not great. We should be creating, that obviously sucks. Yeah. But when you add in the thin ideal into the beauty conversation, now all of a sudden you have like a whole new problem called disordered eating on top of what already was a fucked up situation in which women are being valued on the basis of size, right? Or on the basis of how they look. And so I don't know. I think that there's basically, I think my point here is that, to some extent, I feel like it is very, very, very important that we redefine our cultural construct of beauty. If you assume that the idea of beauty is going to continue to exist as it has, again, for all of time, it is actually hugely, hugely important that we redefine beauty to be inclusive of different types of body sizes, inclusive of different kinds of racial profiles, right? Inclusive of different kinds of physical attributes, right? Yeah. And that is, I don't think you can have a body positive movement that isn't talking about that quite a bit. I mean, I think there's no, if you're not trying to change the beauty ideal, I don't think the body positive movement could be very successful because the beauty ideal is going to exist. It's not going to not exist. We need to change it.
Sure. And I agree with you on that point, but I guess as an individual, how much that beauty should matter in your life, that's the bit where I'm like, people need to take it down a notch. And even as a society, we need to take it down a notch because it's just not, there are so many things that we as humans can be doing that are important in this life. Like, why is beauty so high up? Why do people spend so much of an inordinate amount of their life trying to attain or do things around it? So that's probably, my thoughts on it.
And I don't think anyone in the body positive community would disagree with that. I mean, I think that that's like pretty much a given. And on the same token, part of the body positive movement is like by definition going to be about changing the beauty ideal, because if we don't change the beauty ideal is going to stay the same. The beauty ideal is probably not going to evaporate entirely. We can have conversations about limiting the importance of the beauty ideal in society. I think that is hugely important, right? Like, we need to be raising little girls in particular to value things like their brains, to value things like their spirits, kindness, compassion, whatever attributes are have sort of deeper meaning than what is skin deep, right? Or what is sort of just visible on the outside. And there's no doubt about that. I think that that's a conversation that is happening. I think that that's, I don't think there's anyone out there who would disagree with that. I mean, I think that it's absolutely correct. And simultaneously, I think that people who are trying to change the beauty ideal are critically important to the body positive movement, because the reality, because I think that every woman, to some extent, I think that it is, it does have sort of, I think if we change the beauty ideal, a lot of things would change for women. Yes. Particularly around food. And potentially, right, if you think about, again, evaporating the beauty ideal entirely, that's not probably going to happen. So making the beauty ideal more inclusive is certainly also important. I mean, I think it's also sort of what can we change and what can't we? I think we have probably a better shot at changing the beauty ideal than eliminating it. Yeah, and I don't think we're changing, right. And while we're changing the beauty ideal, we should also be having conversations about its importance and its place in the world, which I think people are having. But I think I see your point, and I also feel that it's important that, I think that the work that people are doing to change the beauty ideal is a really important part of this conversation, because the beauty ideal isn't going away.
Yeah. And I think maybe it's not what the body positivity activists are doing. It's possibly how the individuals are then interpreting that message.
Yeah. Well, yeah. what's coming up for me right now in this conversation is that one of the reasons why you have more people talking about changing the beauty ideal, you have particularly feminists. I mean, I think that there's this sort of, if you think about body positivity as a subsection of feminism, feminists are much more likely to be having conversations about, hey, we need to not raise little girls to be focusing on beauty, right? So like when you think about like sort of the sort of broader range feminists, that's where I hear a conversation about challenging the idea that we should be valued on the basis of how we look more often. Yeah. Whereas when you get into the sort of niche, into the subsection of body positivity, you start to see conversations about changing the beauty ideal a lot more. And I think that I'm definitely exposed to both worlds. So I hear both all the time, right? Like, and I do notice that. I do notice that when I'm looking at people who are really focused on body positivity and fat acceptance specifically, I see a little bit more of a focus on changing the beauty ideal rather than eliminating it entirely. Although, trust me, fat activists and body positive activists are definitely talking about both. Yeah. But then I see a little bit more with like feminist generalists, like, I think about like Anne Friedman or, being like a perfect example. But like, just like the people in my mind who, or Gloria Steinem, if you really wanted to get into it, I think they're having more, conversations where it's like, I don't even want to talk about what the beauty ideal is. I want to, let's talk about how we can not raise women to focus on this thing to begin with. So I'm hearing both. I'm definitely getting both messages, but I do think that there's a slightly different professional out there talking about each. Yeah. And I think a lot of specifically the body positive people who are more often than not, people in recovery and who are more often than not trying to heal their own body image. I definitely see them more focused on changing the beauty ideal and actually kind of trying to come to a place where they're like, I can feel sexy in the body that I inhabit, right? And that's actually something that I am allowed to feel at this size. I don't need to relinquish my sexiness in order to recover from my eating disorder, Yeah. And I see value in that too. I see value in both. I also will say that the body positive movement, probably for capitalistic reasons, right, and for industry reasons, there's a lot of fashion is the area of the body of industry that has been most changed by the body positive movement. Yeah. The beauty industry in general is what has been most changed by the body positive movement because there's actually something to sell. There's an opportunity in the beauty and fashion industry to be inclusive of plus sizes. So that is, whereas there's not an opportunity in industry in medicine to be inclusive of plus sizes. If we start becoming inclusive of plus sizes in medicine, people are going to lose money, not make money, right? I mean, you're taking one of big pharma's big money makers off the table, right? So in the fashion industry, I think there's also definitely one of the reasons you probably see more of a conversation about changing the beauty ideal rather than eradicating the beauty ideal or limiting the beauty ideal in the body positive world is because if there's any part of industry that has clung on to and sort of gotten behind body positivity, it is the beauty and fashion industry because they actually have an opportunity to profit off of body positivity. So it's a cynical perspective, but I think that that's also relevant to mention.
No, it is. And I think that is probably a very big part of it. Mm-hmm. So look, I would like to chat about your program called Stop Fighting Food. So for people who don't know about it, do you want to tell them what it is, who it's for?
Sure. Yeah. So Stop Fighting Food is, a free video training series that's sort of like an introduction to like my basic world and around recovering from diet binge cycling, recovering from binge eating in general, recovering from feeling crazy around food in quotes, as I described it earlier in this conversation. Yeah. Emotional eating is a topic that comes up a lot for people. We talk about that heavily and it's talked about pretty thoroughly in the training. And so the video training series is really like an introduction to some of the core ideas that helped me get out of this insanity with food. And so for anyone who sort of onto what I'm saying, or thinks that, sort of learn something new from this conversation, definitely go check out Stop Fighting Food free video training series if you haven't already. I think that it's going to be, it's a pretty excellent entree into what does it mean to heal from binge eating, specifically in a body positive fashion.
Yeah. And then off the back of Stop Fighting Food, those free videos, you then run a program as well?
I do, yeah. So there's an advanced masterclass program that'll be coming out in March. So in a few weeks after this is probably put out as well. And so for those of you who want to get even more advanced beyond the video training series, the masterclass is it's my flagship program. I mean, it's where I get in deep and do actual coaching with people in a live capacity. You can ask me questions whenever you want, right? So it's a true live group coaching program, pretty intensive for 4 months long. And so if you watch the videos and you're like, oh my gosh, this chick knows something I don't know. What Kool-Aid is she drinking? I want some. The masterclass is really where you're going to get that sort of deep dive into these ideas.
Cool. And just for people listening, I have done the masterclass. I paid Isabel to do the program myself a couple of years ago, and it was amazing. I've learned so much from it. There's stuff that I learned in that I still talk about with clients, and it is been really helpful for me. So I give it a real big stamp of approval, because it was very useful for me, and I know lots of clients who've gone through it as well.
Yay! Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thanks, Chris.
That's right. So look, where can people, apart from the Stop Fighting Food, where can people go to find out more information about you if they want to hear you be talking more, or read some of your articles, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, so IsabelFoxenDuke.com is my blog. Honestly, lately I've just been directing people, if you actually like hearing me speak and want more podcasts, if you Google Isabel Foxen Duke podcast, there's probably going to be a ton of stuff that comes up on Google. You could probably spend days just going through every podcast I've ever been on. But IsabelFoxenDuke.com is where my blog is. And my blog is also a really, really solid intro to this concept. And my blog kind of reads like my book, my personal ebook. Yeah. It's very intentionally written and very intentionally organized for people to dive into this work from whatever level they may be at. But yeah, so video training series, stopfightingfood.com, link I believe in the show notes. Yeah. Or IsabelFoxenDuke.com for the blog, or just Google me. It's all there. There's tons of stuff.
Perfect. And look, I would, again, for people listening, I would recommend signing up and getting on Isabel's mailing list. I'm on there, and I would say 95% of the emails that she sends, I then share on Facebook, because I think they're that good. So you'll enjoy whatever content you get from her.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Love that.
So, look, thank you so much for coming on the show again. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, and I think you're a wealth of knowledge. So, yeah, thank you for everything today.
Thank you, Chris. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7, health.com.